Valley a mere 60 years ago. I'm a third-generation cattle rancher on the west side of town, the Lower Elk River. My grandparents on my father's side moved here. They started out in Nebraska during the Dust Bowl, but they wanted to stay in agriculture. My grandfather could come here to hunt and fish, thought it was one of the most beautiful places he'd ever been. And they sold everything in their homestead in Gothenburg, Nebraska. My dad and one of his brothers got on a tractor, on the old age tractor, and pulled all of their farm equipment westward over what is now I-80. 3-day trip by tractor. And they settled into the Lower Elk River Valley, where fortunately they were able to buy a little bit later on, and that's where we've been able to stay. And so it's my luck tonight to tell you a little bit of the history about agriculture in the Routt County and the Yampa Valley. And I'll give you a little bit of warning, it's only the white man history. We're not going to, we're just going to talk about how we have progressed through the years. Let's start with cattle and sheep, because that's one of our major commodities here. It has been since really the 1870s. George Baggs. Name familiar to anybody? The town familiar to anybody? Baggs, Wyoming? George Baggs brought the first herd of Texas Longhorns into this country in 1871. And that started the migration with the cattlemen driving animals to the north to feed them in the summer, and then they drive them, and by drive I mean cattle drive, not where they put them on trucks. They did this with horses and did them all on foot. By the 1880s, thousands of cattle were being brought into this area for summer grazing. The largest count at one time was 65,000 head were being brought through. By the early 1890s, the sheepmen had discovered this area and started bringing large flocks in. And if you've heard about the range wars, everything you heard is true. It got very, very volatile here for a while. A lot of murders, a lot of animals were slaughtered on both sides. And the range wars really did have an impact on what happened to the settling of the West. In 1907, the Routt National Forest realized that there was a real need to permit how many animals could actually be fed on their grasses. And so they started opening with permits both the grazing for sheep and cattle. In 1907, they actually allowed 30,000 sheep and 40,000 cattle to be grazed on the Routt National Forest. 1909, to kind of help with this range war business, they built a drift fence on Buck Pass to rabbit ears to separate and said cattlemen here, sheepmen here, just kind of like we had to do with the snowmobilers and the skiers later on. By 1931, 143,000 head of sheep were permitted on the Routt National Forest. Think about that. That's a lot of sheep. 143,000 head were coming in here in the summer and grazing and then going off in the fall. One of the major changes that helped facilitate agriculture as we knew it in this area was the railroad. And in 1908, the railroad came down into the Walcott. Most of you know it by the State Bridge area. And that opened up the possibility to then bring supplies northward. Still by wagon train and stage, but at least it gave them an opportunity to get things a little bit closer to us. 1908, the railroad was extended to both Yampa and Steamboat. 1910, made Hayden. 1913, they got to Cray, and they had really intended to go further, but money ran out. The government didn't have money even then, and the railroad got as far as it could, and that's where that railroad still stops today. By 1913, more cattle were shipped from Steamboat Railway Yard than from any other point in the United States. And that is because we were draining out all of southeastern Wyoming, eastern Utah, and the western Colorado area. And they were coming up to this area to get on that train to go to the auction places in Denver and Chicago. During the 1930s, Hayden was the largest rail shipping center for lambs, again, for the same reason. That's pretty amazing when you consider we're talking the whole United States and these two towns were known. Steamboat was known as the cowliest town in the United States long before it was known as Ski Town, USA, or Bike Town, USA. Okay, small grains also played a large part in it because as we brought the cattle and the sheep in, Then we had to figure out how to feed them. As you're heading west, you might see the Overlook Ranch as you go out past Steamboat 2, past Heritage Park, before you drop into Milner. That's Diane Hawley lives there now, and she's a fourth generation. Her grandparent, or her great-grandparents rather, brought the first dryland farming into this area. And after they got this little bit of grain established, and they had to do all this by hand, all the plowing, everything was done with horse and by hand. And they developed such a good product for themselves that they actually overrated their consumer market, and they, in the 1880s, literally hauled their grain to Rawlins, Wyoming to sell it, with a team and wagon. You know, we think we have it tough. Those guys, those people were hardy. 1890, the Yampa Valley Milling and Elevator Company opened, and it developed a local market for these farmers, which allowed us then to be providing wheat, barley, and oats to local consumers. In 1900, we produced, this is the first thing that we think we grew here that they boxed and packaged and sold, but it was the Joe Dandy cereal. Do you know why it's called Joe Dandy? Two guys were sitting around after it had been, they were testing it, and one of them looked at the other and he said, "Joe, this is pretty dandy cereal." I got the name, it's now Joe Dandy. 1912, the Farmer's Elevator in Steamboat opened, and in 1917, the Hayden Elevator opened, and Tammy and her family are still keeping that going in a different manner, but they have kept it there for us all to enjoy. By 1922, Routt County led all other counties in the state in dryland yield production of wheat, barley, and oats. This little dryland county led all other counties in the state. And by 1985, over 85,000 acres were planted in small grain production. By comparison, we have about 5,000 today. The reason for the demise of these grains, cost of production versus the price that we receive for the crops. If you're going to stay in business, you have to get a little bit bigger, and the cost of trying to stay in business just gets higher and higher. Also, our dry land can only produce limited yields here. It's about 25 bushels of wheat to an acre of ground. The government programs changed, and a lot of ground that we had been farming went into a conservation reserve program, which was a permanent grass program. Great for the wildlife. It really increased the amount of wildlife that we have here now, but it played hell with our grain crops. And then, unfortunately, the age of our farmers. The average age of farmers in Routt County, I believe, is 58. At least. We're seeing a huge change. I'm very optimistic that more and more young folks are going to come in and are going to take over. But at that point, that's one reason that people started taking their ground out of production and trying to figure out an easier way to make a living. Okay, vegetables. Let's talk about that a little bit. In 1910, the Routt County Strawberry Company was founded. Yay! And most of you know where Strawberry Park is. It was actually named because of the production of the strawberry that was the strawberries that were planted and grown there. And in 1911, 528 crates were loaded on a train and shipped out of here. This is pretty amazing when you think that it all had to be picked by hand. They were all planted by hand, the ground was tilled by hand, and then they were packaged and were sent out. In 1911, the Routt County Produce Association was formed, mostly based on potatoes. South Routt produced well over 30,000 pounds. That's right, 30,000 pounds on 2 acres. So it proved to be a very, very good crop for a short period of time. Cow Creek, which is just south of Steamboat, produced 14,100 pound sacks on 10 acres. So it was yielding about 7 tons to the acre for potatoes. We also grew a lot of peas. During the 1920s and the 30s, more than 500 acres of peas were planted and harvested, again, all by hand.
Is this still in Strawberry Park?
No, it's all over the county. 1923, the Yampa Valley Head Lettuce Association was formed. And lettuce and spinach became a major crop that went out of here. More than 2,000 acres were under cultivation, not only in South Routt area, but also up the Elk River Valley. And in 1926, 720 train carloads of produce were shipped to California. Now, I got to tell you a story about this because I'm so in awe of our ancestors and how hard they worked. Somebody came in here and decided, all right, let's tear up this ground and we're going to do lettuce and spinach. But we're going to have some way to get it out here on these train cars to keep it cold to go to Denver or to California. And what happened was that these ranchers in the dead of winter went out and they started cutting blocks of ice off of the ponds and the reservoirs. And they'd take it out of there, they're cutting it again by hand, they'd haul it out of there with teams of horses, and they built ice houses and they stored all that ice until the crop was picked in August or September. Then all that ice was chipped and packed on top of those crates of lettuce and spinach, and they were shipped out that way.
Incredible.
Isn't it incredible? You're absolutely right, Tim. Isn't it incredible? Okay, the reason for the demise of all this. Okay, if we made this work, then why isn't it still going? Well, for one thing, it was hard to get labor in here. When you are talking 500 acres of peas and 2,000 acres of lettuce and spinach, you need somebody to come in and pick because we did not have the people to do it then, and it was just hard to get people in here. The overhead costs were high. Seeds could not be readily raised in this valley, so they all had to be brought in from somewhere else to grow. And then, of course, everything had to be shipped in and out. The population base was not enough to support the amount of food that was being grown here. Started to deplete the soils. Didn't have a lot of knowledge about the fertilizers and the additives that we do now, and things that can be used to keep those soils going. Our weather's a little tough. The growing seasons were pretty long. The freezes came late, and the droughts came often, as they still do. And then along with that was the cost of keeping those rail lines open year-round. Have you ever seen? Okay, I'm done. I'm very happy. Do you want me to go ahead and just finish up? Also the Depression, yes. Depression played a big part in that. And although the Depression itself probably affected agriculture folks less because they were more self-sustaining on their places, it did affect the whole area, and so the whole nation. And so those crops that were being shipped out of here, there was nobody to buy them, and they didn't have the money to continue on with it. The next crop that we do pretty darn well here is hay and alfalfa. And of course it was originally grown to feed cattle and horses and sheep and cattle, sheep and hay. Let me try that one more time. The cattle, sheep and horses that resided in the valley during the winter. Traditionally we get 1 cutting of hay per year, 1 to 2 cuttings of alfalfa. Also, every farm had a small herd of dairy cattle, and generally 1 to 10 head. And to be quite honest, it was those dairy cows that kept most of these ranchers and farmers alive for a good number of years, because at that time we were also allowed to ship cream and milk on the train, once again, to Denver. And I can remember this, my folks had a few head of cows. Every Monday morning we brought the cream cans in, took them down to the depot, they'd go out on the train, the cans from the previous week would be sitting there for us to do it. And that was really kind of what kept my folks going, was the fact that they could milk a few cows. We had a powdered malt milk factory here in Steamboat for a while. Okay, what makes it farming and ranching economically? What are the issues here from a historic perspective? First of all, our weather. The drought, the heat, freezing, the frost, 12 months out of the year. I'm sure all of you have seen it snow in July here. The grasshoppers. 2002, for any of you that were here, you remember the decimation of our pastures. it was just pretty darn incredible what happened, and you have no control over those kind of things. National and international commodity prices. We really are at the mercy of outside sources for what we can get, what we can charge for the larger commodities. Land prices. In the 30s, you could buy a piece of ground here for $25 an acre. That same ground now goes for between $25,000 and $30,000 an acre if it has running water going through it. The banks are not inclined to loan to beginning producers. And this is something that we're working on. We're going to try to figure this out because there's a great demand, and some of our bankers are thinking a little different. The infrastructure is not available for the large-scale dissemination of ag products. We produce a great amount of beef and sheep here. We can't harvest it because of the USDA rules for the processing plant. Again, it's something that we are talking about, we are working on, and we think we're going to come up with some solutions to keep our local beef and our local sheep, along with our local pork, our local chickens, and our local goats. Oh, and bison, too. We've got all these producers that are working hard to make things happen, and we're going to come to some solutions so that we can make food get into everybody's freezer right here at home. Ag folks just simply can't compete with construction wages and hours. If you're working on farms and ranches, you're working 7 days a week, usually 16 hours a day. And then one other thing that is the management of endangered and protected species. Your ranches and farms are great holders of our wildlife, and these issues become greater all the time for us as to what we can and cannot do with that. In closing, I would just say that agriculture is truly a wonderful way of life, and I am very, very blessed to have spent my life doing it. All of us who are involved are eternally grateful to have that opportunity to raise food and fiber and to raise our children in this type of environment. We're hardy people that are willing to invest our personal resources into the natural resources that we are entrusted to care for. We will build a barn to care for our animals and crops before we'll build ourselves a house. We'll develop a spring for additional water before we take a vacation. We take great pride in our brand and our operation. We are grateful when we have a banker who will extend our credit one more year, and don't get too upset when that stock market crashes, because we go through a market crash about once every 4 years. We are independent, and yet we trust our lives and our livelihood to God every day. And I'm proud to be involved with agriculture and to represent the ag community. Thank you.